Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm an educator at the museum. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Erika Schwartz, a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum LA. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, and for listening to Erika Schwartz, who will share her story with you. After Erika shares her story, you can type in your questions and she'll answer as many as possible. Those watching on Zoom can use the Q&A feature, and on Facebook on the comments section. I'm so happy to welcome Erika to this talk this morning. Erika and her husband Bill were such an important part of our museum community, and they moved to Missouri about a year ago. And thanks to this technology, she's able to resume her talks now. She used to speak to our school groups regularly, and we are
I think Michael froze, but I think you can go ahead and start talking, Erika.
Okay, thank you. I will. Okay, let me just start my screen share. Okay. I grew up in two worlds. One was that of a Holocaust survivor, born in Nyíregyháza ghetto in Hungary on April 23rd, 1944. Just one day before the ghetto was sealed, just 2 weeks before the deportations to Auschwitz began. The other world was that of a child of a Holocaust survivor. My experiences are my mother's experiences. My memories are my mother's memories. I was only a year old when the war ended. Even without any specific memories of the horrors, I grew up knowing that my father had died brutally in a forced labor camp near the Austrian border when I was barely 11 months old. I knew that my great-grandmother, grandmother, aunts, and little cousins had all known me, had held and loved me just 2 weeks before most of them were gassed to death at Auschwitz. I knew that my father had briefly looked at me and kissed my face when I was just 1 week old. Those were the events that tied me to the world of being a survivor. Those were the events that defined who I was for the first 44 years of my life. By the early 1940s, people in the United States who were paying attention were already hearing rumors about the murder of multitudes of Jews in Eastern Europe. My grandfather's sister Rose, who had immigrated to the United States when she was a teenager, began to bombard my grandfather with letters begging him to get his family out of Europe. She had done all the work necessary to get the entire family to the United States. She had all the paperwork, all the permissions, everything. She begged him. His response was no. He had the naive belief that his family was safe and that the war would be over long before the Nazis might turn their attentions to Hungary. My parents met in July of 1941 when my mother was visiting an uncle in Budapest. It was love at first sight. I'm sorry. I've lost a slide. It was love at first sight. They were married on August 20th, just a few weeks after they met, and just 1 week before her 20th birthday. The newlyweds settled in Budapest, where my father was manager of a bridal shop. Life changed drastically when Hungary, allied with Nazi Germany, rounded up all the young Jewish men and imprisoned them in forced labor camps. I don't know exactly when my father was imprisoned. That's a question that I never asked. I totally skipped a page. I'm sorry. This is the first time I'm doing this. I didn't realize it was two-sided. I don't know when my father was imprisoned. That's a question that I never asked my mother, and no amount of research has turned up that information. I do, however, have the date of his death at the camp, March 8th, 1945. I know that he was imprisoned before I was conceived. My mother told me that early on, wives were permitted to visit their husbands in the labor camps. She told me how the young couples would walk out to the countryside, find as private a spot as they could, and make love. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for them. The forced labor of Hungarian Jewish men began in March 1939. I believe that my father was probably taken either in late 1942 or very early 1943. My mother told me that when she first learned that she was pregnant, she was terrified of bringing a baby into a world that was already swirling with rumors of Jewish genocide. So she had an abortion. When she told my father what she'd done, he was beside himself with anguish and made her promise to never do anything like that again. She promised and kept the promise. I was conceived in July of 1943, somewhere in the countryside of the Hidegzed forced labor camp. When my mother learned that she was again pregnant, she decided to leave their Budapest apartment and move in with her parents in Nyíregyháza. She was too frightened to be alone, and the distance of 124 miles to visit my father was now an impossible barrier. On March 19, 1944, the Nazis occupied the town of Nyíregyháza. By April 17th, they had completed the construction of the ghetto, encircling the entire Jewish area, including my grandparents' home. The Jews of Nyíregyháza and all of the surrounding towns were herded into the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed in preparation for transporting the Jews to Auschwitz. Because my grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, all of my mother's female relatives and their children were now living in the house. The men had long ago either been taken into forced labor or had been rounded up and shot, as was my grandfather. Now living in the house with my grandmother were my mother's sister Margit and her two little boys, Mickey and Imre. There was also my mother's sister-in-law Clara and her little girl, Zsuzsi. My great-grandmother Dina and my mother's younger sister Olga rounded out the family members who were crammed into the house. I was born on April 23, 1944 in the Nyíregyháza ghetto, just one day before it was sealed. By the end of April, the miracle of my survival had begun, and my mother and I were no longer in the ghetto. On May 12th, the deportations to Auschwitz had begun. My great-grandmother Dina, grandmother Hani, Aunt Margit with 9-year-old Mickey and 7-year-old Imre, and Aunt Clara with 2.5-year-old Zsuzsi were all transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. On the day they arrived, my great-grandmother, grandmother, and 3 little cousins were murdered in the gas chamber. By the end of May, all 17,580 Jews in the ghetto had been transported to Auschwitz. It's estimated that between 600 and 800 survived the war. My mother's older sister Margit and her sister-in-law Clara were the only ones in the family transported to Auschwitz and permitted to live. Like many of the young women who were not clutching children, they were selected for the slave labor in the camp. Although the two young women had arrived with their children, some of the capos, who were Jewish prisoners who were trusted by the Nazis to assist them, tried to convince all of the young women who had just disembarked from the cattle cars to hand their children over to elderly people. These capos knew that if the women got to the selection area with their children, they would immediately be sent with the children to the gas chamber. Some of the capos tried to save the lives of the younger women by calmly telling them that it would be better to let the children go with the older people. The young women, of course, not knowing that they were sending their children to their deaths. Margit and Clara handed the three children to my grandmother. I can't imagine what it must have been like for my grandmother to be shoved into the gas chamber with her three little grandchildren, knowing that they were all about to die. Clara survived the war. It was Clara who actually told my mother how her sister Margit died. Margit had survived until the very end, working in the kitchens in Auschwitz. On the day of liberation, on the very day that the Allies entered Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from the Allies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margit was killed on the day of liberation. How did my mother and I survive, and what happened to my mother's 19-year-old sister, Olga? That's the rest of the story. As I mentioned earlier, my father was imprisoned in a forced labor camp. The Hungarian government's pretext was that these men were needed to build roads and dig ditches on behalf of the war effort. The work that they were required to perform was meaningless. They were barely given food or water. The true intent was to work them to death. The Nazis had devised a system to easily account for all of the Hungarian Jews, and this system was central to the miracle of my survival. From various sources, the Nazis obtained lists of all the Jews with their addresses. Although my mother had been living with her family in Nyíregyháza, her official address was still the Budapest apartment where she and my father had previously lived. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth to me and that we were imprisoned in the ghetto, he escaped from the labor camp and headed straight to Nyíregyháza. With him, he had papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. Instinct told him that if he could get me and my mother to Budapest, we might be safer. In the labor camps, rumors had swirled among the men about the death camps. These men were at the forefront of those who believed that the rumors were true. Sadly, most Hungarian Jews believed that the Nazis would be defeated before anything would happen to them. Fortunately for my mother and me, my father wasn't among those who put his trust in this very dangerous belief. He arrived at the ghetto when I was just a few days old. It had taken my mother 3 days of hard labor to give birth to me, and my face was still very swollen from the effort. My mother told me that she was afraid I'd look like that forever, and she cried over how I looked. She told me that my father took my face in his hands, kissed me, and proclaimed me the most beautiful baby he'd ever seen. That story caused one of the greatest pains that I felt when I was growing up. Having heard about his love of children from older surviving cousins on his side of the family, I spent decades deeply grieving the absence of the man who was my hero. After arriving at the ghetto, he immediately went to the office of the local authorities. He presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. Predictably, he was repeatedly turned down. He camped on the steps of the police station for days. When I was a little over a week old, miraculously, he was granted papers to take us to Budapest. My father wasted no time getting us out of the ghetto. He was the first of 3 people who saved my mother's and my life. The second person responsible for my survival was my grandmother, Honey. After my father received permission to take us to Budapest, my mother suddenly insisted on staying in the ghetto with her mother. He had already told her that after getting us to Budapest, he was going back to the labor camp. He explained that he believed he was probably being hunted and that he was afraid to be with us in case he was discovered with us. So again, terrified of being alone, my mother refused to leave Nyíregyháza. My grandmother, Honey, literally pushed her out the door and locked it behind her. My father took us to Budapest and went back to the labor camp where he died on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camp. The story of my survival would end there, except for one other person who gave the ultimate sacrifice to save my life. My mother's 19-year-old sister, Olga, somehow slipped out of the ghetto when my father got my mother and me out. She was on the same train that took our little family to Budapest. When they reached Budapest, my mother and Olga obtained Christian identity papers. They managed to get an apartment and for 2 months lived quietly and safely as 2 Christian women with a baby. Olga took care of our needs by selling sugar on the black market. On July 5th, 1944, she left the apartment to get food. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby Hungarian Arrow Cross soldiers immediately ran in her direction. Olga turned and ran back into the building, the soldiers close on her heels. I don't know what ran through the mind of my 19-year-old aunt. She must have realized that she had very few options, or none at all, that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me. She made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on a Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944. My mother and I were never discovered. When I was in Budapest with my rabbi a couple of years ago, I learned for the first time that my Aunt Olga was buried in a single grave in the Jewish cemetery just outside of Budapest. I have no idea how that could have happened in the chaos of 1944 Hungary. In 2017, our family had a stone erected on what had been for 73 years, her anonymous grave. Also in 2017, when I went back to Budapest to see Olga's headstone, I was finally able, after decades of searching, to find the mass grave in which my father is buried. So ends the story of the murder of my entire family. That's the story of Erika, the Holocaust survivor. However, that's not the end of my story. The rest begins with the story of Erika, child of a survivor. My mother and I were the sole survivors. I grew up with no father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins. Although most of my father's siblings did survive, they had little interest in us. So for all intents and purposes, I grew up with no extended family. And I was raised by a mother who had been brutally damaged by her losses. She lost everyone. By the end of the war, she was a 24-year-old mother with an infant, no husband, and no family. After decades of battling her endless demands for attention from me, I finally realized that she was trying to fill that void with me. No matter how hard I tried, there was no way that I could fill that role. And to make matters even worse for me as a child, we moved often and I wound up going to 9 different elementary schools. I was always the new kid on the block and rarely stayed in any one neighborhood long enough to make friends. So I had no family and no friends. I spent the first 40 years of my life defining myself as a victim. I was seriously depressed. As a teenager, I would gaze at the night sky, find the brightest star, and pretend that it was my father looking down at me. I would cry and tell him how much I needed him. Then in February of 1988, when I was 44 years old, I heard someone say a very simple sentence that would probably not even be noticed by most people. I literally saw fireworks when the words sunk in. It was this simple, quote, I may not have control over everything that's happening around me, but I do have control over what happens between my two ears, end quote. That was the first time in my life that I realized that my happiness or lack of happiness or at any moment was my choice to make. I could find joy in my day or I could find misery. I could see only the bad or I could seek what was good. It was always my choice to make. So at the ripe old age of 44, I set off on a journey of self-discovery. I wanted to learn who Erika really was, the Erika who was neither a Holocaust survivor nor the child of a survivor. What I learned was that I was silly, very much of a rebel, and when I had the courage to say what popped into my head might actually be something funny. I had no idea that I had a sense of humor. I learned to cherish all that I had rather than focus on what I didn't have. I learned to count my blessings, and after a lot of practice, learned to let go of things and people over which I had no control. That didn't mean not loving the people in my life who were out of control. It simply meant accepting that they were in God's hands, not mine. I remind myself daily that I have a wonderful husband of 56 years and two amazing brothers, the product of my mother's marriage to my stepfather. Those two guys are my best friends, and I'm blessed. In 1988, my precious granddaughter was born, my one and only grandchild. The odds that she would even be in my life were very slim. My son, her father, was very young, a teenager when she was born. Her mother could easily have shut my husband and myself out of their lives. Instead, her mother allowed us to have a full, close relationship with her. My granddaughter was and still is the cornerstone of my blessing list every day. And her mom has turned into the daughter that I never had. When my granddaughter married and had 3 children, my amazing great-grandsons, I felt as if my heart would burst from joy. From a life that began with no one to love and no one who loved me, I now had more love than I had ever imagined. When she and her family moved from California to Missouri, I felt as if my heart had been torn from my chest. But here I am, talking to you from Springfield, Missouri, because she and her husband convinced us that they actually wanted us to live near them. I've landed in paradise in the twilight of my life. My life has literally gone from hell to heaven. And there are so many more, my 2 sons in California and a slew of nieces and nephews whom I adore. So my closing message, and take it away if you will, is that no matter how frightening or dismal life may seem, there are always blessings to count. And one of those blessings could change your life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika, for sharing your story with us. As always, we're so grateful and appreciative to hear from you and to hear about your optimism, especially during this time. And we do have some questions for you. First, it looks like your friend Brenda Rich says hello. We have one question for you is, when is the last time you went to Hungary?
The last time I went to Hungary was, I wish my brother Mark was on the line, because it was with him and his wife. I believe that was in 2018 or 2 or 3 years ago, that was when I discovered finally the mass grave that my father is buried in, and we went to see the headstone that we had put on my Aunt Olga's grave. So it was just a couple of years ago.
Thank you. When did your mother pass away?
My mother passed away in 2016. She lived in California along with the rest of us. When my husband and I moved to California in 1979, she followed us everywhere, and she passed away in 2006.
Somebody would like to know if you, how often you've done these talks for educational purposes about your family's experiences during the Holocaust, and when did you get started doing that?
Well, I've done it in California. I did it a lot, and the story of what's happened here in Missouri is a miracle. But I started it because of a very strange thing that happened several years ago. When I kind of went on the journey of self-discovery, I turned my back completely on even the topic of being a Holocaust survivor and even discussing anything about the Holocaust. And several years ago, I was at a service, the service that's held at cemeteries between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I was at a service at a cemetery, and the person who was on the stage said, "If there are any Holocaust survivors here, please stand. We'd like to honor you." And there were about 300 people in the room at the time. And I was sitting there, my husband was sitting next to me, and he kind of poked me with his elbow. So I stood up, and then I looked around, and to my amazement, found that I was the only one standing. And it was then that I started thinking about the fact that I am probably one of the youngest Holocaust survivors, and that I had an obligation, that I really needed to start dealing with this and telling the story. So I believe that the first place I spoke was at the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum. Spoke there many times. I spoke at high schools when I was in Los Angeles. I spoke at the Museum of Tolerance. But I have to go into when I moved to Springfield here, which does not have a large Jewish community. I was warned that I was probably going to have to give up telling the story of my family. And that broke my heart because I had gotten to love it. And I have to tell you that once word got out that I was a survivor, the number of requests for me to speak was almost overwhelming. I've spoken at high schools here. I've spoken at the St. Louis Holocaust Museum. I was supposed to speak at a Yom HaShoah service at a local military base, at a church luncheon. It's been amazing, and I love doing it. I'm so thrilled to be doing this on Zoom, and hope to get back to doing it in person soon.
Well, thank you. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're so happy to have you with us today for many reasons. But now that you live in Missouri and we're doing Zoom, this works so well. So we're so grateful for that. One of our audience members would like you to elaborate. You mentioned that you didn't feel loved growing up, and that you didn't feel like your mother easily showed love to you. Can you please elaborate on that?
Right. I think there's a possibility that one of my brothers is watching, and this was a very unique experience for me. I know my mother loved me, but I came to realize from the demands that she put on me in terms of my time and my relationship with her, when I became an adult, I came to realize that she needed me to be everybody that she had lost. and it was very difficult. She wanted me to see her as my best friend, and then there were many times she wanted to be my only friend. So it was very difficult. I was never good enough for her, is the bottom way of putting it. Although I knew she loved me, she really couldn't show it. So it was very difficult. I had nobody to turn to. As I said, I had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles, nobody that I could call. And so I grew up really believing that I was a bad person. And it's about the only way that a child can grow up, if they're constantly being criticized as not being warm, not being loving enough, not being affectionate enough, not spending enough time with, your one parent. So I had to, I had a lot of work to do to heal when I grew up.
Thank you for sharing that. And on a similar note to that, how often did you speak with your mother about what had happened? And was there ever a point that she sat down with you and told you about these details?
She was very open about it. That was one thing. I don't ever remember a specific moment that she started to tell me the stories of her family or what had happened. She talked about it a lot, and I'm grateful for that. So as far as I can remember, I grew up from the youngest age knowing what had happened to the family. And then when I got older and was able to ask questions, she always answered my questions. And as a matter of fact, I have some video, actually quite a few hours of video, where I was interviewing her in her later years and asking questions about her childhood and the family. So she was always very willing to talk about it.
Thank you. And you mentioned that your mother had remarried and then you had two brothers. What sort of a change was that for you in your life? And how old were you when your mother remarried?
I was 7 when she married my stepfather. And I was the one that was responsible for her meeting him. We were living in Florida at the time. And she tells me that we were in the car driving, and we saw a sign for a new community, and there were open houses, and I wanted to go look at the houses. And so she drove, and we went into the office, and my stepfather at that time was selling real estate, and that's how she met him. So I was 7 when they married, and I was 9 when my brother Mark was born, and I was 10 when my brother Michael was born. It changed my life in a wonderful way. I was not the jealous only child who suddenly had to share. I remember being ecstatic when each of my brothers were born. I was so excited. So that was wonderful, and maybe that's one of the reasons why today, even though I'm 10 and 11 years older than my brothers, we are. I can't say that I have any better best friend than my two brothers.
Thank you so much for that. And then moving back a little bit, how did you and your mother leave Hungary and come to the United States? And when was that?
Well, right after the war, my mother's aunt, Rose, the one who had tried to get the family out before, my grandfather's sister who lived in New York and tried to get the family out. As soon as Aunt Rose discovered that my mother and I had survived and that the rest of the family as of that moment, had vanished because nobody knew who was dead or alive. She started to bombard my mother with letters to get us to the United States. Initially, my mother refused because everything was so chaotic when the war ended, and she had no idea who was dead or alive. She didn't want to leave Hungary for fear that somebody in the family might be searching for her and never be able to find her. So we stayed in Hungary until I was about 3.5 years old. And then Aunt Rose finally convinced my mother that we had to get out, because by that time, the communists were making it much more difficult to get out of Hungary. Well, by that time, my mother could not get out easily already. Aunt Rose was able to get her papers to get out, but she had to leave me behind. I was 3.5. And the arrangements were that my mother was to leave me with a couple that she had known for quite a while, who she trusted. She left me with them. She came to the United States and immediately started working to get me out. And she was assured that she'd be able to get me out very quickly. Well, immediately after my mother left Hungary, this couple who were childless and not able to have children decided that my mother was young, she could have other children, they were going to keep me. So they disappeared with me. So I was kidnapped. I had no idea that I'd been kidnapped because they were very good to me. So, I was happy. Fortunately, before my mother left, she had left somebody else legally as my guardian, not this couple. So as soon as she realized that this couple had disappeared, she contacted this gentleman, and it took 6 months for him to find me and get me out of Hungary. I have the telegram that my mother got saying that the couple had disappeared. My mother kept that. And I have the telegram that my mother got the day that I was found. And so it was just after my 4th birthday. And I remember flying into Newark Airport and getting off the plane and seeing my mother up on the observation deck and saying to her in Hungarian, "Servus, Anyuka." Hi, Mommy.
Thank you for sharing that. So when you came to the United States, you mentioned that you moved around a lot. Why was that?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with my mother's restlessness. At first, we first lived in an apartment building in the Bronx. And I have to mention, since my husband is sitting right across from me at his desk right now, that's where I met him. I was 4 years old when I met the man that I eventually married. His family lived in that apartment building, and my mother and his mother became best friends. So we saw each other over the years and eventually fell in love and got married. We lived in that apartment building for about a year. And then my mother we moved to Florida. We lived there for 6 months. We moved to California, lived there for 6 months, then went back to Florida for 6 months. And then even after she married my stepfather, there were quite a few moves. We initially moved to Maryland, and I'm losing track of the different places, but I did count at one time that I went to 9 different elementary schools, until we moved to a home in Jersey City, New Jersey, when I was in the 8th grade. I had never lived anywhere longer than maybe a year and a half. And we finally stayed in that home until I got married when I was 19.
Thank you very much. And we actually did have a question about your husband. Some of our viewers wanted to know more about how you met your husband. So you were family friends and you lived next to each other.
Yeah, we lived in the same apartment building when my mother and I first came to the United States. My mother could speak no English, but she spoke Yiddish, and his mother could speak no Hungarian, but she spoke Yiddish. And so they became very close friends. And so even with all the moving around that we did, our families stayed in touch. We would see each other occasionally for special, events, birthdays, bar mitzvahs, things like that. And I had a crush on him when I was 10. We went to the Catskills with his family one week during one summer when I was 10 years old. And I still remember he was 14. He's 4 years older than me. So he was 14. I already had a crush on him. And I remember he was going to the watering hole to go swimming with his friends. And his mother told him he had to take me because I was all alone. And he was very upset. So when we got to the watering hole, I remember he threw me in the water and threw worms at me and made me cry. But when I was 16 and he was 20 and we hadn't seen each other for a couple of years, that was when the romance started. And we were married when I was 19.
Well, thank you. And it seems like everything worked out. That's so nice to hear. Going back again to when you left Hungary, just to clarify, you traveled alone from Hungary to the United States when you were 4?
Well, I wasn't really alone. There was a couple, and I don't remember them very well. I don't remember them at all, actually. It wasn't the couple that kidnapped me, but I do remember that I was put in the care of a couple who was also immigrating from Hungary to the United States. And they accompanied me and, took care of me until I got off of that plane at Newark Airport and ran into my mother's arms.
Thank you very much. And how did your family photos survive? You're fortunate to have quite a lot of the photos of your relatives.
They were in an album. They were the only photos that my mother had of her family. They were in an album that my father had given her as a wedding present or something. I think I remember her saying. And so she had put the family photos in that album and somehow managed to keep it hidden throughout the war and with her throughout the war. And it was the only thing she had left when the war ended, and brought it with her to the United States. And I thank God for scanning, because growing up, my brothers and I used to have little, like, who's going to get mom's album? But now we all have the pictures and we're grateful.
That's great. Thank you. What did your mother do and stepfather do for work in the United States?
Well, my stepfather was an engraver. Wedding, in those days, the high end, wedding invitations and things like that. I remember helping him in his shop. My mother never really worked. I think I remember her telling me that she had a job as a waitress once early on. And she said that she got fired on the first day because somebody had ordered a stack. She said they meant pancakes and she thought they said steak. And she brought him a steak and he got angry and she got fired. I don't recall that my mother ever really worked.
Thank you. A couple of our viewers would like some more emphasis on your kidnapping in Hungary. Is there anything else you know about it or have to share?
Well, I only know it happened. But I have no bad memories of it because this couple were very kind to me. I must have been very self-absorbed when my mother left when I was 3.5, because I actually have like a photo in my head of a memory of the day she left. And I remember standing at the train station, and I had asked her about this later, and she said, yeah, it's exactly how it happened. I was standing at the train station, and she was already on the train that was taking her out of Budapest to wherever she was going to catch the plane to the United States. And as the train started to pull out and my mother was hanging out the window crying, yelling to me, I bent down and started picking up pebbles. And I actually remember doing that. And I asked her later, and she said, yeah, you did. So I wasn't traumatized by her leaving. They were wonderful to me. I remember them taking me to the zoo. I remember my 4th birthday, and the gifts they gave me and the beautiful chocolate birthday cake. So it wasn't a traumatic thing for me at all.
Thank you for sharing. At any time throughout your life, have you been connected with a Holocaust survivor community, or have you been in touch a lot with other survivors?
Yes, I did. When I first moved to California, which was in '79, so I was like 35 years old at the time. There was a psychologist, I believe, I can't remember her name, she was Sarah something. She started a group. It was like I don't know if it was a therapy group, but it was a group for child survivors. And I heard about it and I joined it, and I only attended 2 of their sessions, and I never felt like I belonged there because all of the other survivors were much older than me. You know, having been an infant when the war ended, most of the people in the survivor community who were active in the survivor community were older than me and were talking about their experiences. And I couldn't remember any war experiences. I had none. So I never felt like I belonged within that community. It wasn't until after, I had that experience at that cemetery when I started to make an effort to really get more involved. I went twice on the March of the Living, which is a wonderful program put on by the Board of Jewish Education. Actually, it's a worldwide program in Los Angeles. It's done by the BJE. That sends high school juniors and seniors, along with Holocaust survivors, to Poland and to Israel. In Poland, they visit Auschwitz and other pertinent places. And I did that twice and got to know other survivors. Those were wonderful experiences. But those are really the only connections I've had. I haven't really sought to have relationships with other survivors, and I still think it's because of my age. I just don't feel like I can match what they've been through. I guess that's the only way to put it.
Thank you for sharing. And you must be thinking of Dr. Sarah Moskowitz.
Yes.
Yes, and in fact, she's worked with many survivors in our community. We, regardless of your age, we certainly have had such an important session with you, sharing your story. And I know that you have really moved our audience. We've gotten so many positive comments thanking you for sharing this really important story. We do have a couple other questions. It looks like one more. You mentioned that you had filmed your mother. Have you done anything with that testimony, the videos that you got of her speaking about her story?
No, I had them put on DVDs, and I've given copies to family. But that's all. She was interviewed during the Show Up project. So there is that testimony, but no, I haven't done anything with that.
Thank you. And then when you were, when you, as an infant in Hungary, when you were living with false papers, did your mother talk about anything you had to do outwardly? Did you go to church or anything like that?
No, she was in hiding. She only lived very briefly with the Christian papers in that apartment. Um, my Aunt Olga died on July 4th of 1944. That was only a couple of months after I was born. And I believe my mother said that after that, my mother left that apartment and went into deep hiding, bombed out buildings and things like that. So I don't think no, she didn't try to live as a Christian after that.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like those are all the questions. I would like to emphasize again that we received so many comments while you were speaking, people thanking you so much. A lot of your friends from California and Missouri were watching and said hello. And again, your story is so important because you have always shared with students in our community this message of hope and being able to find a light during any kind of difficult situation. I know that I remember from seeing you interact with students in our community that had really shaped them and helped them move on with their futures. And now, thanks to our technology, you have reached people all around the world. Like I said, California, Missouri, but other places too. We have people watching this from all over the country and other countries as well. And having your testimony now online, people will hear your message and learn from your story. So Erika, we thank you so much for being with us. And we're so happy that we can do this. And thank you for everything you have done for our community and our museum. And we look forward to welcoming you back to speak to groups in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
It's truly our pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for watching. As a reminder, our museum is closed for the time being, but we have regular virtual programs. We have survivors speak every Thursday at 11 o'clock. A week from today, we have Ernie Weiss, survivor from Czechoslovakia, Hungary. And we look forward to welcoming everyone at the museum in person when it's safe. In the meantime, please follow our website and social media to see our programs. Wishing you and everyone a happy, healthy, and safe weekend. Thank you so much again.